Her earliest memory was not one of fear or joy, but of the smell of rain on dry earth. It was the kind of scent that could only be born from a parched summer sky, finally cracking open to release its burden. Rachel had been playing in her backyard, a place of endless wonder and discovery, when she first encountered this olfactory symphony. Her mother called it petrichor, a fancy word that Rachel had rolled around on her tongue 100 times before finally committing it to memory. It was a simple moment, uncomplicated by the chaos that would later define her life. As Rachel grew older, her curiosity grew with her. Her small town was steeped in whispers of the supernatural, and she found herself drawn to the local legends like a moth to a flame. One such tale spoke of an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a place where no one dared to tread after dark. It was said to be haunted by the restless spirit of a woman who had met an untimely end. Rachel's friends whispered about the ghostly apparition that could be heard weeping in the night, her sorrow echoing through the hollow chambers of the decaying mansion. Rachel, ever the skeptic, scoffed at their stories, but a spark of intrigue was planted in her heart nonetheless. On a particularly daring evening, Rachel gathered a group of her most adventurous friends, and together they approached the house. Their laughter and the crunch of gravel underfoot were the only sounds to break the stillness of the night. The moon was a waxing crescent, offering just enough light to cast eerie shadows across the property. The house loomed before them, its windows like gaping mouths in a silent scream. Rachel felt a shiver dance down her spine, but she squared her shoulders and led the way. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the walls seemed to whisper secrets in a language none of them could understand. Rachel's flashlight beam danced across the peeling wallpaper, revealing faded patterns that looked like ghosts trying to escape their paper prisons. They moved from room to room, each one more unsettling than the last. It was in the attic, amidst the cobwebs and discarded trunks, that Rachel first heard a soft, mournful sound that seemed to resonate in her very soul. The weeping grew louder, and Rachel's heart began to race. Her friends' nervous giggles turned to hushed whispers as they too heard the sorrowful melody. Rachel knew that she had to find the source, to uncover the truth behind the legend. But as she climbed the rickety stairs, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that she was not alone in her quest for answers. The attic was a maze of shadows and forgotten memories. Antique furniture huddled in the corners, their wooden limbs twisted and broken, as if in agony. Rachel's friends followed close behind, their flashlights casting a cacophony of light and dark across the space. The weeping grew more insistent, guiding Rachel to a door at the far end of the room. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it lay an inky blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Rachel's hand trembled as she reached for the knob, her mind racing with the horrors that might await her on the other side. Yet she felt compelled to continue, driven by a force she couldn't explain. The door creaked open to reveal a small chamber, its walls lined with ancient books and yellowed newspaper clippings. At the center stood a rocking chair, swaying back and forth with a rhythm that matched the sobs Rachel heard. In the chair sat a figure, shrouded in a tattered veil. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight. Was this the ghost she had come to find, or was it a trap set by some cruel local pranksters? She took a tentative step forward, her eyes locked on the figure in the chair. As she approached, the weeping grew louder, more desperate, as if the spirit was begging for her to leave. Rachel's friends hovered in the doorway, their faces a mix of terror and excitement. They had come for a thrill, but the reality was so much more than they had bargained for. With trembling hands, Rachel reached out to lift the veil, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of her friends upon her, their anticipation palpable. The fabric was cold and clammy against her skin, and as it fell away, Rachel's world came to a standstill. What she saw was not the decayed visage of a long-dead woman, but the reflection of her own face, twisted and distorted in an antique mirror. The weeping grew louder, and Rachel realized with a start that it was coming from her own throat. The room began to spin, the walls closing in around her, and she stumbled backward, tripping over the rocking chair. The world went dark, and Rachel knew no more. When she awoke, Rachel was lying on the attic floor, her friends gathered around her, their faces etched with concern. She sat up slowly, her head pounding and her thoughts scattered. The room was still, the weeping gone. Rachel looked at the mirror, now lying shattered at her feet, and felt a coldness spread through her. Something was wrong. Something was wrong. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As they made their way back downstairs and out into the night, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that she had brought something back with her, something that had latched onto her soul. The rain had started again, and the smell of petrichor filled the air. Rachel looked back at the house, now a silhouette in the distance, and wondered if she would ever be the same. In the days that followed, Rachel tried to push the events of that night from her mind. But the feeling of unease grew stronger with each passing moment. She would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. Whispers seemed to follow her, echoing her own thoughts back to her, taunting her in the quiet of her room. Rachel began to withdraw from her friends, the weight of her secret too heavy to share. The house had changed her, and she didn't know how to explain the fear that now lived inside her. One night as Rachel lay in bed, unable to sleep, she heard it again, the soft, mournful weeping that had filled the attic. It grew louder, closer, until it was as if the spirit was right beside her. Her heart raced, and she threw back the covers, her bare feet hitting the cold, hardwood floor. She searched her room, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but found no one. The weeping grew fainter, retreating into the shadows. Rachel sank to her knees, her trembling hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Determined to face her fears, Rachel decided to investigate the house once more, this time alone. She waited until the town was asleep and the moon had disappeared behind a veil of clouds. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a mist that clung to the earth like a living shroud. She approached the house with a newfound sense of dread, each step feeling like a march towards her doom. As she reached the front door, it swung open of its own accord, the hinges groaning a mournful welcome. Rachel stepped inside, the cold embrace of the darkness enveloping her. The weeping grew louder, guiding her through the house she had once found so fascinating. The walls seemed to breathe with malice, and Rachel knew she had to find the source before it consumed her. The climb to the attic was torturous, each step echoing through the house like a declaration of her intent. Rachel's heart felt like it would burst from her chest, but she couldn't turn back now. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw it the rocking chair, still swaying slightly, the veil torn and discarded. The weeping grew deafening, a cacophony of sorrow that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Rachel approached the chair, her hand reaching out to steady herself. As her fingers brushed the cold wood, she felt a jolt of energy, a connection to something ancient and malevolent. The chair stopped moving, and the weeping ceased. Rachel looked into the mirror, now whole once more, and saw not her own reflection, but the twisted visage of the ghostly woman. The creature's eyes locked with hers, and Rachel felt a chill run through her, colder than any she had ever known. The house was alive, and it had chosen her as its next victim. Her friends' voices grew faint, their footsteps retreating into the distance. Rachel knew she was on her own. The ghostly woman began to speak, her words a whisper that grew into a roar. Rachel couldn't understand the language, but she felt the hatred and anger behind the sounds, the desperation of a soul trapped for eternity. The room grew colder, and Rachel could see her breath in the frigid air. The mirror's surface rippled like water, and the woman's hand reached out, skeletal fingers grasping for her. Rachel stumbled back, her heart racing as she tried to find a way to escape. But the walls closed in, the room shrinking around her until she was backed into a corner. With a primal scream, Rachel lunged at the mirror, shattering it with all her strength. The ghostly hand retreated, the weeping giving way to an unearthly shriek that pierced Rachel's ears. As the shards of glass fell to the floor, Rachel felt a sharp pain in her side. She looked down to see blood seeping through her shirt, a piece of glass embedded in her flesh. The house trembled, as if in response to the ghost's fury. Rachel knew she had to get out, to somehow sever the connection that had been forged between her and the vengeful spirit. She stumbled down the stairs, her vision blurring with pain and fear. As she reached the front door, Rachel felt a cold wind blow through the house, extinguishing the candles she had brought with her. The darkness was complete, and the silence was more terrifying than any sound she had heard. The door slammed shut before her, the wood splintering as if it had a mind of its own. Rachel was trapped. The weeping began anew, but it was not the same sorrowful melody she had heard before. This time it was a cackle of triumph, a sound that chilled her to the bone. Rachel turned, her eyes searching the inky blackness for any hint of an escape. and in that moment she realized that the house had a plan for her, a fate far worse than she could have ever imagined. The story of the weeping woman was not a simple legend, it was a warning, a foretelling of her own end. Rachel took a deep breath and stepped away from the door, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She had to find a way out, or she would become just another whispers in the night. Her hand found the wall, and she began to feel her way through the house. Each step was a battle against the unseen forces that seemed to push against her, trying to keep her in the prison of shadows. Rachel could feel the presence of the spirit, a weight that grew heavier with each passing moment. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tightening with fear. The house was alive with malevolence, and it was hungry for her soul. The floor beneath her grew slick with something cold and wet, and Rachel knew she had to be careful not to slip. The smell of decay grew stronger, and she felt bile rise in her throat. She stumbled into a room, the flashlight beam from her phone finally piercing the darkness. It was a room she had not seen before, a space filled with the remnants of a life long lost. A four-poster bed, its curtains drawn back to reveal a mattress stained with age and something far darker. A vanity, its mirror cracked and blackened, the only reflection Rachel's own terrified eyes. The weeping grew closer, the cackle turning into a chant that seemed to resonate within her very being. Rachel knew that the spirit was taunting her, feeding off her fear. Panic set in, and Rachel began to run, her feet slipping on the treacherous floor. She could feel the ghostly hand brush against her shoulder, her hair standing on end as the coldness followed her. The house was playing a twisted game, and Rachel was the pawn. The walls shifted and changed, the layout of the rooms a labyrinth that she could never hope to escape. Rachel's mind raced, trying to find some logic in the madness, some pattern to the chaos. But there was none. The house had a mind of its own, a hunger that could never be sated. The chant grew louder, the words now clear in Rachel's ears. They were words of anger and despair, a plea for vengeance that had gone unanswered for decades. Rachel understood then that she was not just a curious girl seeking thrills, she was a vessel for the weeping woman's rage. The spirit had chosen her, had drawn her into this nightmare, and now it would not let her go. Rachel had to fight back, to find the strength to resist the pull of the darkness. Her hand closed around something cold and metallic on the floor. A key. Rachel didn't know what it unlocked, but she knew it was her only hope. She turned and faced the approaching shadow, the chanting growing so loud that it drowned out the sound of her own racing heart. With trembling hands, she inserted the key into the lock of the bedroom door and turned it with all her might. The house shuddered around her, and Rachel felt a surge of power. The door swung open, and she stepped into the hallway, the weeping now behind her. Rachel didn't know where the key had come from, but she knew she had to keep moving, to find a way to end this nightmare before it was too late. The house grew quieter, the weeping fading into the distance, and Rachel allowed herself a small, hopeful smile. Perhaps she had found the weapon she needed to escape the clutches of the weeping woman. But as she turned to face the staircase, she saw the shadows coalesce into a form, the ghostly visage of the woman herself standing before her. Rachel's heart stopped, and she took a step back, her hand tightening around the key. This was not the end, it was only the beginning of a battle she had never wanted to fight.